My name is Bob Rexman. I'm the City Council representative from Ward 3. In fact, I live just a few houses down Fruit Street, which is outside of the back of the senior center. I'm also on the organizing committee for the Design Northampton Week. Thank you all for coming this week. I hope that you will all continue to participate in the events that will take place this week. Your active participation is critical. It's essential to the success of the Notre Dame Urban Design Studio charrette process. I'm going to introduce our mayor, Claire Higgins, who will say a few words of welcome. When she is done, Joel Russell, who is the chair of the organizing committee, will tell you about the schedule for the week so you can attend all these events you're going to come to. And then introduce Professor Philip Bess of architecture from Notre Dame, who put the team together. When he is done, there will be ample time for your questions or comments. Thank you for coming tonight, and hope we will see you many times again this week. Madam Mayor, will you please come up and say a few words?
Hi, everybody. Okay, you gotta be a little more excited. Good evening, everybody. There we go. Okay. I just want to take a quick moment to welcome our guests here to Northampton from South Bend and from that great Irish Catholic College, Notre Dame. Not that I'm biased or anything. But I'm hoping that this week is a good experience for all of you, that you get to really experience and enjoy Northampton in all its glory and all its conflict at the same time. And I think that's going to be an important part of the week. And somebody said to me at the breakfast this morning that, boy, there's a lot of active people here. And that's really the case. There's a lot of active people here. The town of East Amherst just did a T-shirt, and they said Amherst. It says Amherst, where the only thing silent is the H. And I'm sorry that we didn't steal that before they did it, because it's true for Northampton too. So I hope you get a lot of information, you're able to take it all in and give us lots for us to discuss, because we like to discuss these kinds of things, as you can see. I'm looking forward to seeing your work, and I'm looking forward to hearing all the comments that everybody has, and I think this will be very productive for the city. So thanks for being here.
Well, I'm Joel Russell, and I thank you all very much for coming tonight. I just want to say a couple of words about how this came about, and then introduce our main speaker for tonight, Professor Philip Bess. It was a team effort by about 15 people whose names are posted on the board in the back over there, and they worked very hard to pull all this together in about 2 months. And so I'm grateful. Could the members of the Northampton Design Forum Organizing Committee just stand and be recognized, please? Thank you very much. I have been involved as a professional member of a team like the Notre Dame team in other places, and it's a great thrill to be able to bring something like this here. Because what can happen in a community when you have an extended period of discussion of the things that are important to you about your community is really very exciting. And I think, and not only to be able to talk about it this way, but also to then have it illustrated and have pictures and drawings. So I want to quickly go over what we're doing this week. Tonight is the introductory presentation. I'm so glad you all came. You tell your friends about it if they weren't able to be here. There's going to be a DVD of it playing at the studio at 126 Main Street. We hope as soon as we can turn it around from NCTV, which we appreciate for taping it, and Adam Cohen's website will probably have it as well. And the introduction is an important way to sort of get us all on the same page about vocabulary and way of thinking about urban design issues. The basic outline of the week is that it starts tomorrow morning, and every day from about 9 until 5, the studio will be open. During parts of that period, There will be actually times to engage with members of the team, and there's a schedule which you probably have picked up, and it's also on posters around town, which indicates the most important times when it's open for public access. It's kind of like working in a fishbowl. Everybody's going to be being in the studio and drawing, and the community's going to have a chance to watch it. But there's specific times called out, afternoon and evening, when there will be public interaction sessions where they will present their work in progress, and you'll have a chance to talk about it, comment on it, give suggestions, and then if you can have time, come back the next night and see what they did with your suggestions. So it's a very interactive process, and it progresses over time. I think that's part of the value of it. There's something about sleeping on something where the next day it sometimes see things in a new and exciting way. So please come as much as you can. Please tell your friends to come. A couple things about the handouts. There's a fairly thick handout, which I hope you picked up at the door. If you didn't, go back and get it, or raise your hand and we'll pass it around. This is the material that Professor Best will be talking about shortly. There's also, this entire effort is being supported by contributions, tax-deductible donations. We've already raised a big chunk of it, but we haven't finished. So there's a contribution box at the back, and there are also forms that you can take with you, and you can leave a contribution at the APE Gallery. Make out the check to APE Limited. APE Gallery, Available Potential Enterprises, is our nonprofit sponsor, and they accept contributions on our behalf and have enabled us to make this happen. And our thanks to Gordon Thorne and APE for making that wonderful space on Main Street available. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Philip Bess. He's somebody I've known about for many years. We've sort of crossed paths indirectly over the years, and I've heard about his program at Notre Dame, which is nationally and internationally known for the kind of training it gives young architects and planners in traditional urbanism, and he will be going into that more. But he's somebody that I think will have a great deal to contribute to the community with his students. He's a professor at Notre Dame. He has over 27 years experience in architecture and urban design consulting, and he began overseeing the Notre Dame program in 2004. He teaches graduate urban design and theory, and continues his professional work as a design consultant for municipalities, architects, and community development corporations through the Office of Thursday Associates. From 1987 to 88, he was the director and principal designer for the Urban Baseball Park Design Project of the Society for American Baseball Research. He's a baseball guy. And he's written in Boston. In August 2000, he directed and coordinated the ultimately successful Save Fenway Park! Which was a design charrette which occurred in Boston and successfully did something that I think we all appreciate, Save Fenway Park. He's the author of 3 books, including City Baseball Magic, Plain Talk and Uncommon Sense About Cities and Baseball Parks. There's a theme there. Inland Architecture, Subterranean Essays on Moral Order and Formal Order in Chicago, and most recently a book called Till We Have Built Jerusalem, Architecture, Urbanism, and the Sacred. I've actually been reading and finding fascinating. He's a Master in Architecture from University of Virginia, Master of Theological Studies in Church History from Harvard Divinity School, and BA in Philosophy from Whittier College. So in addition to being an architect and urban designer, he's a scholar, author, professor, and community organizer. So anyway, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Philip Bess.
Thank you, Joel. It's really hot in here. If you don't mind, I'm going to take my jacket off. You loosen my tie. Yeah, I think it'll work. Yeah. Yep, this works. Can everybody see the? I'm told to attend to these microphones. and thank you everybody for coming. It's great. This is it's a wonderful turnout. It's wonderful to be here. I should say, for me, this is a return to this area. As a few of you know, I actually lived in Amherst for a year in 1975 during an interesting period in my life between sort of academic pursuits, and during which time, among other things, I worked as a cook for a sorority at the University of Massachusetts, and also drove a 5-college bus. So I'm happy to see that the 5-college bus system is still working. And I went for almost 30 years without getting back to this area until I visited actually Williams about 3 years ago to recruit at Aaron Helfand's school, and also then came and did a recruiting visit to Smith. And one thing led to another, and here we are. But I'm delighted to be here. And I must say, we're all, the students and I are both overwhelmed at the public interest in this event. And so we thank you very much for inviting us. I want to thank especially the Northampton Design Forum, and especially Joel Russell. I mean, words cannot express how impressed we are with all the work that has been done in anticipation of our visit. So I want to add my thanks to the to the Northampton Design Forum for all your efforts. I'd like to very briefly introduce the students who are sitting over there in the corner, and actually one in the center operating the projector. Kalinda Brown is a graduate. These are all graduate students. Kalinda Brown is an undergraduate from Notre Dame's architecture program. She worked in Washington, D.C. for a while before coming back to graduate school. She's a double donor. She's from Idaho and pursuing her second degree from Notre Dame. Dan DeGreve got his undergraduate degree in architecture from the University of Cincinnati and is pursuing his master's degree at Notre Dame. Josh Eckert likewise did his undergraduate degree in architecture at Notre Dame and worked for 5 years in New Jersey before coming back to pursue the degree in urban design. Scott Ford, our third Notre Dame graduate, except that he didn't study architecture as an undergraduate. He studied political philosophy at Notre Dame, and then took a degree in land use economics at the University of Cambridge, at Cambridge University in England, before deciding that he wanted to go into architecture. Aaron Helfand, the favorite son of Northampton, who's a graduate of Williams College and a lifelong resident of Northampton, went to Williams College. And then Crystal Olin, who got her undergraduate degree in environmental studies at the University of Colorado, and is pursuing her master's degree in architecture at Notre Dame. So we're all excited to be here, and again, thank you very much. I wanted to just say something very quickly about the structure of Design Northampton Week. Joel touched upon some of those things, but I want to reiterate maybe 3 or 4 points. First of all, as I hope you all know, the doors to the workplace are open, and so it's open to the public, and people are invited to come in throughout the week and see the work that we're doing. We have formal sessions when the work will be available for review, but anybody's invited to come in and look around and see what we're doing at any time during the week. The assumption of the charrette is that the intention of the charrette is that it's an inclusive public process, and so we're very happy to see this big turnout. We've been warned. We know from experience that well, we've asked everybody to bring their interests to this event this week. Maybe what I should say first is that we ourselves do not bring any political agenda with us except an agenda for traditional urbanism. And also that we do expect you to bring your political agenda to the charrette. That's an explicit part of our invitation. We do presume the goodwill of all the participants who will be engaged in these activities with us this week, and we ask everyone else to do the same. We also recognize that we will try as best we can to address people's concerns over the course of the week and really over the course of the semester, because this week-long process is just the beginning of a semester's worth of work. And so there's going to be opportunity for additional input beyond this week. But we also recognize that in asking everyone to bring their interest, that not all interests ultimately converge. And so we recognize that, we trust that you'll recognize that, but we hope that out of a conversation, that at least some of these interests that may appear to be opposed to each other can in fact converge. Because we presume that urban design cannot solve every community problem, but that good urban design can solve some community problems without at the same time creating others. And I think if we can have some success in that, at least in suggesting that idea and giving you all an idea of how that how you might proceed after we're gone, then it will have been a success for us as far as our involvement with Northampton is concerned. As for the students, we're going to benefit from being here and all the work that we do with you in the next week. So we're really looking forward to that. I will mention specifically the formal times for the public feedback sessions, and actually maybe I should describe very quickly. Actually, you should have received some handouts, but one of the handouts is a schedule of events for the week, and you might want to take a look at that. The way that it's structured basically is that tomorrow and all day tomorrow and Tuesday morning are spent in information gathering meetings. The students really begin designing on Tuesday afternoon. There will be an evening presentation on Tuesday evening at 7:30, and then for the next 3 nights, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday evenings at 7:30. Also a sort of smaller scale afternoon presentation on Wednesday and Thursday from 1:30 to 2:30 if people are interested and can stop by. And then we want to leave open whether on Friday, whether we have the evening and the afternoon presentations. We'll just see how that goes and see where we are. But Friday to Saturday, it gets pretty hectic with the students finishing their presentation work for Saturday evening, and then Saturday, or I should say Saturday afternoon, the final presentation at 4 o'clock, which will run from 4 to 6, which happens to be occurring simultaneously with the Notre Dame Michigan game. And so I may have the students make the presentation, and I'll just kind of keep track of what's going on. It doesn't look promising, I have to say, but we have hope. With respect to these evening and afternoon sessions, I want to say that these in particular are important sessions because they're public feedback sessions. And as I say, we're going to be meeting. The Northampton Design Forum has arranged a number of meetings for us, and there's some open slots on Monday and Tuesday for people to come in and talk to us about specific issues that are of interest to you. But it's really in the public meetings, particularly in the evening, also the couple that are scheduled for the afternoon, that I think are the most productive, because the process of that is the students present the work and throw it open to you for your critiques and your comments. And at that point, that all takes place in a public forum. And so if everybody's bringing their agenda, then we sort of get an idea of what all of the issues are out there on the table. And there's really, that's the occasion for really trying to consider what the implications of these things are and how perhaps urban design can address some of these concerns. So especially I want to extend the invitation for you to come to the evening sessions and to the Wednesday and Thursday afternoon sessions as you're available. And then before I start, I just want to mention the handouts that you should have all received. It's a 5-page handout, double-sided. The first page is just a kind of outline of the things that I'm going to talk about this evening. The second page is 10 characteristics of good traditional towns and neighborhoods, which is something that I'll be saying something about, but again, it's there for your reference for this evening and also subsequently. a characterization of traditional urban, spatial, and building types on the third page, along with a brief discussion of what's wrong with sprawl. And then on the next page, the rural to urban transect, which is also something that I'll be talking about, which I want to discuss as a possible basis for form-based codes. And we'll talk about why form-based codes might be a helpful thing for any community thinking about the kinds of issues that Northampton is thinking about. A page from Bill Leonard's of the National Charrette Institute, What is a Charrette? And I realize that charrette is a controversial word in Northampton. And that what we're doing technically is not a charrette, it's a design form of exercise. But, and then, let's see, 3 pages, the Charter of the New Urbanism. And I should say something very briefly about the Charter for the New Urbanism. First of all, if you look at the Charter for the New Urbanism, I think that you will recognize a number of themes that are similar to themes that are found in Sustainable Northampton in that document. And so, and I'll talk more about that later, but I think I would encourage you in reading the Charter for the New Urbanism that you read it and have in mind also the similar, at least where there are potential points of convergence with the themes and the ideas and intentions of Sustainable Northampton. And then also, just to maybe to clarify a little bit, because like the word charrette, New Urbanism has a kind of controversial connotation in some circles. And I would say that some of us, the students and I, perhaps some of us are New Urbanists. I'm a member of the Congress for the New Urbanism. I don't know if any of my students would characterize themselves as New Urbanists or not. Some of us are simply traditional urbanists, and I think that that's actually the more important thing to think about, because what I would suggest is that New Urbanism, at its most basic, is simply traditional urbanism as it is pursued in a legal and cultural context of sprawl. In other words, it's the attempt to pursue traditional urbanism in a cultural and legal environment that makes traditional urbanism very difficult, if not impossible, to pursue. And so the sort of Sisyphean task that the difficult task that the New Urbanists have undertaken is to try to promote traditional urbanism in the contemporary context of sprawl. And so I think it's I think you want to think about what we're presenting, what I'm presenting this evening, certainly as an argument for traditional urbanism. And then finally, I think that the last thing is just a 2-page, a little essay called The Asphalt Rebellion, which is an argument about walkable environments and different means of getting around in addition to the automobile. And again, that's a theme that I know is part of Sustainable Northampton and is an issue that we'll be discussing over the course of the week. That said, I'd like to begin my more formal comments with a discussion about, well, as you can see up on the screen, there is a quote at the top. You probably recognize the images from Northampton. One of the reasons that we're here in Northampton is because it's not simply that it's not even especially that we think Northampton quote unquote needs a lot of work, but rather Northampton is a really good place, and that a lot of what determines where we go on these kinds of exercises has to do with we go to places that are good places, but that somehow their traditional urban environment, the thing about these places that people love, has started to be threatened by post-1945 patterns of making human settlements. And so what I want to talk about this evening is a kind of introduction to the way that we think about what we mean by traditional urbanism, what the elements are of traditional urbanism, as background information for you so that you have some idea of where we're coming from and the kind of vocabulary that we're using. And I'm going to say a lot of words, but I'm going to show a lot of pictures too, because the pictures are worth a lot more than my words. But we do operate, at least some of the time, maybe my students less often than I do, with a certain assumption about cities and what cities are for. And Aristotle, a quote from Aristotle's Politics that begins up here, that every group of people with a shared purpose, every community, is established with a view to some good, because human beings always act in order to obtain that which they think good. But though all communities aim at some particular and limited good, the city, the polis, which is a community of communities, the highest of all, embracing all the rest, aims at the highest good. It aims at nothing less than the well-being of its citizens. Now, that's a statement, an ancient statement about the nature and purpose of cities. The quote below gets into more of the details of the kinds of things that we're going to talk about this evening. The quote below from Leon Creer, who's a contemporary traditional architect and urbanist. He writes with respect to the formal order of cities, which is really what the primary intention or the primary the primary subject of urban design is the formal, the physical, material order of cities. And in writing about that subject, Creer writes that a city can only be constructed in the form of neighborhoods. Each neighborhood must have its own center, periphery, and limit, and must integrate most of life's daily functions, dwelling, working, leisure, education, worship, within an area based upon the comfort of a walking person. Simplicity must be the goal of the urban plan, however complex the urban geography and topography. The city must be articulated into public and domestic spheres, civic architecture and vernacular buildings, squares and streets in that hierarchy, and urban blocks should be as numerous and small as their occupying uses permit. Slide. So what I want to talk about, really 5 subjects. Space is a thing, an urban thing. Second, the elements of the city, what is urban form. Third, 10 characteristics of good towns and neighborhoods. Fourth, a little introduction to what we call the rural to urban transect and transect-based zoning. And then finally, traditional architecture and urbanism as what a colleague of ours refers to as the original green. Next slide. Okay, so space is a thing. Space is an urban thing. Next slide. Probably you're all familiar with this this little diagram, which illustrates in a very concise way an idea from perceptual psychology, which is that human perception is based upon focusing on some object against a field, against a background. And the intent of this drawing is to illustrate a kind of ambiguity in thinking about the relationship of a figure to its background. And the ambiguity in this case, of course, is that if you look at the white as the figure and the black as the background, then what you see is a drinking cup or a vessel, a drinking vessel of some kind. Whereas if you look at the black as figures and look at the white as being the background, what you see are 2 human faces facing each other in profile. So that there is a kind of reversibility in this drawing about what's figure and what's ground, but it illustrates that how you perceive or what you perceive depends upon necessarily you're focusing upon something as a figure against a background. And so this is a term that is pertinent to what I'm going to talk about with respect to the ideas of space and anti-space. Next slide. The idea of space and anti-space comes from, or the terms as we use them were coined by a colleague of ours who's taught at the University of Notre Dame recently, Stephen Peterson. Not as it came about as a consequence of a kind of ambiguity in the culture of our understanding of what space is. But I think that for most of us today, particularly if we've grown up watching Star Trek or reruns of Star Trek, space, the final frontier, that we think of space as something that is a void. That space is the context in which you see or experience objects. Space is the absence of something or the context of something, but it's background to looking at figures. But what he argues is that this overlooks another historical meaning of the word space, particularly with respect to how space is understood as in terms of urban design. When he says that he makes the point that space is the medium of urban design. Now, what does he mean by that? He doesn't mean space in the way that we ordinarily tend to think about it, but rather he says that contrary to thinking of space as something that is indeterminate, universal, extensive, vast, something that doesn't have shape or a figure, but is something in which figures are seen, he says that historically there's been an experience of space as a figure. Space is something that is finite. Space is something that is shaped, that has a form, and in the context of urbanism, certain kinds of spaces can be given specific kinds of names that refer to these spaces, and that in fact names like plaza and square and avenue and boulevard and street, that all of these are examples of historic urban spaces, and they refer to something finite rather than infinite, something man-made rather than something that is discovered, something that's an artifact, something rather than something that is necessarily natural. And so what he suggests, and I think correctly, I think his insight is correct, is that actually in the culture, when we use space to refer to both kinds of conditions, we're making a mistake because they're really opposite conditions. And so he wants to call the one space, the figural kind of thing, is space, and the other, the sort of modern Star Trek version of the way we think about space, is anti-space, not suggesting that one is good and the other is bad, but rather that they are opposites, right? So that you cannot have a condition that is both spatial and anti-spatial in the same way at the same time. And that something that is spatial, to the extent that it becomes anti-spatial, it is destroying the notion of space, and vice versa. That's all very abstract. So what's an example of what I'm talking about? This kind of drawing and photograph intends to illustrate that. This is the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. It is this long, sort of oblong prism that's a void. It is a figural void. When you are standing in that, you have a sense of being in something that has a shape. Whereas this is Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation in Marseille, which is, for our purposes, I would ask you to think of it as a figural solid. It's a rectangular prism solid that exists in a context of what we call anti-space, what we're calling anti-space. So that this is a spatial condition where the space is the figure and the buildings are the background. And this is its opposite condition where the building is the figure and it exists in a background or a context that is anti-spatial. Okay? And if you look at the plan drawings of these, this is the plan drawing of the Uffizi Gallery, this is a plan drawing of the Unité d'Habitation by Le Corbusier, you can imagine that this was something that was carved out of this and picked up and set down over here. Or you can likewise imagine that that this is something you could pick up and drop in there and complete it as a solid. So that the notion of making space can be thought of conceptually as something that you carve out of a solid to make a figural void. But what these do is that these represent opposite conditions: a building in the context of anti-space, a space in the context of buildings acting as a background that define the space. Next slide. And here's another look at that. So here's the anti-spatial condition, and here is the spatial condition. And again, when we talk about anti-space, one of the things you have to bear in mind is that the idea is that when you talk about anti-space, you have to concentrate on the background, right? Because if you look at a picture that I'm describing as anti-space, what you can probably focus on is an object that's in the, that's in the picture, but it's the context that is what I'm characterizing as anti-spatial. And again, the reason why we're looking at this is because the medium of historic, traditional, urban culture is spatial. Next. So here's some examples of these conditions. This is an example of a spatial condition. It's a figural void that's defined by vertical edges. Next. This is a spatial condition. The former condition was a plaza. It was a kind of centralized space, enclosed, finite. This is a linear space, a street condition. Next. This is a spatial condition, the Champs-Élysées in Paris, an avenue. Next. this is at street level, the Champs-Élysées, and again you have this spatial condition that's defined by the vertical edges. It's a linear space, but it is, you have a sense of enclosure of vertical edges that make it spatial. Next. It doesn't have to be buildings that define space. Certain kinds of gardens can define space. This is the Villa d'Este in Italy. This is at Versailles in France. Again, the vegetation is planted to make space. So you have a spatial condition even in a garden. Next. And then these are examples of what I mean by buildings or objects in an anti-spatial condition, right? So that my guess is if I hadn't been talking about anti-space and I said, asked you to look at these and say, okay, well, what's the most important thing in each one of these images? You'd say, well, that's the important thing here, and this is the important thing here, and this is the important thing here, and you'd be correct. But what I'm asking you to do is to look at that. I'm asking you to look at the background of those figures, which is anti-spatial, which is what we mean by anti-spatial. Next. So this is an example, and where I said that the medium of traditional urban culture is spatial. The medium of modernist architecture and modernist urban design is anti-spatial. That one of the attributes of the revolution in design that took place starting in about the third decade of the 20th century is that there was a focus upon buildings, upon virtually every building as an object, right, and less of a focus on the idea of making space. And so you have these kinds of iconic images from the 1920s by the Swiss architect Le Corbusier. This is his Plan Voisin for tearing out a large section of Paris and replacing it with this grid of high-rises. Here's the Seine right here. Some people think it's insane, and this is a ground view of that, and you can see that the buildings are objects in a kind of park-like or garden-like landscape. But what I'm suggesting is that this modernist icon is an embodiment of a notion of anti-space. It is anti-spatial. Next. Here's the Plan Voisin again, just as kind of benchmark. In Chicago, a 1980s project called Presidential Towers. Again, you can see they're conceived of as objects. They're not making space, but they're seen as objects in an anti-spatial context. Next. The Plan Voisin in downtown Houston. Again, the perimeter of downtown Houston. Again, an anti-spatial kind of context. Next. And then the post-1945 sprawl environment is also an anti-spatial kind of context. Now, you do have rows of buildings that have more or less the same relationship to the edge of the street, but they're low, they're pretty low rise. They're pretty far apart from each other, and so you have less of a sense of a spatial enclosure that you get in a traditional city because you have to have a certain ratio of height to width in order to feel yourself in a spatial condition, and you generally don't find that in post 1945 development. Next. The previous slide was an example of residential developments in an anti-spatial context. This is an example of commercial developments in a context that's essentially anti-spatial. Next slide. So you get the idea of this basic notion of space and anti-space. And again, certainly from the point of view of a traditional urbanist, anti-space in an urban setting is problematic, is not regarded as a good thing. But I do want to emphasize that this notion of space and anti-space has more to do with their opposites, rather than saying that one is always good and one is always bad. Because certainly some of the slides that we saw of the church in the landscape or the villa in the landscape, that's certainly a beautiful thing, but it's not an urban condition. Specifically, it's not an urban condition. So with respect to traditional urbanism, anti-space corrodes traditional urban spaces like squares and plazas and boulevards and avenues and streets. So I want to talk about what is urban form. And in the context of thinking about what is urban form, I want to preface my remarks by saying that any city, I think that in order to understand the nature of a city, of any city, that at the very least, it's necessary to understand that any city is at least four orders that exist simultaneously, that are all necessary components of a city, and that are all factors that are working upon each other all the time. And sometimes, one has more influence over the other, but you never have a city that is lacking the four conditions that I'm going to describe. So first of all, the city is an environmental order. And I think that the way you want to think about that is that cities are, and by city, I should maybe back up here, because I'm not necessarily talking about Manhattan. I'm talking about, when I say city, Northampton is actually sort of about the right size. When Aristotle wrote about cities as being the locus of the best life for human beings, he was thinking about communities that range from 5,000 to 20,000 inhabitants, which incidentally is about the size of a traditional urban neighborhood, which is, I think, important to what Leon Creer said earlier about cities, big cities being made up of neighborhoods. And so when I say city, don't assume that I'm thinking necessarily Manhattan, Chicago, though in thinking New York, Chicago, it is important to understand that part of what makes New York livable, part of what makes Chicago livable, are the fact that it's made up of neighborhoods, and that you live in a neighborhood in certain ways not unlike the way you live in a small town. So it's important to keep this idea of scale in mind, and we'll come back to this. But anyway, that any city, thus understood, is an environmental order. It's the way that the human animal inhabits the landscape. And human beings do that in better ways and worse ways with respect to how that environmental order does or does not sustain the human beings that live there, right? So that human beings that foul their water, right, or that otherwise harm the environment that's necessary for human beings to flourish, are not making good cities, and ultimately there are consequences that come of that. So any city is always and everywhere an environmental order. Any city is always and everywhere, secondly, an economic order. It's a place of exchange. It's a place of artisanship. It's a place where wealth is created. It's a place where material goods are exchanged. And so it is not possible to understand how cities work apart from understanding them as necessarily an economic and always an economic order. Third, a city is always and in every respect a moral order. That is to say, it has to do with how human beings behave toward one another in ways that are predictable and just. And that every human society, or I should say every good human society, every good city, that is a primary concern, is the establishment of some sensibility of what is just and of some consistency in people's understanding of the good habits and the rules of behavior that allow everyone to flourish both as a community and as individuals. And then finally, a city is always and everywhere a formal and material order. That is to say, it has some kind of form, it has some kind of shape. It's made of things that make space, right? Space is a void, but space is a thing that is made by physical objects. Every city is always and everywhere a formal order. So, having said that, I want to raise the question about, I want to address the issue of what is urban form? What are the characteristics of urban formal order? And what I want to suggest is that there are certain fundamental characteristics of traditional urban formal order. Its formal order is a network of streets and blocks that contain within this network of streets and blocks a mix of daily life activities within pedestrian proximity of one another. And I'll show you some examples of what I mean in terms of this scale, what I mean by pedestrian proximity. But what this comes out to is settlements of something along the size of 120 to 200 acres. And if you want to have an idea of what that means, a half a mile by a half a mile square is 160 acres. Or a half mile diameter circle is 126 acres. And the significance of that half mile diameter is that from edge to edge, it takes the average human being about 10 minutes to walk from edge to edge, to walk a half mile. It takes the average human being about 10 minutes to walk a half mile. 5 minutes to walk from center to edge. And so those are important numbers that will come up not only later in my presentation, but also I'm quite certain in the course of our work this week. Urban, I want to talk about then, within this urban formal order, certain identifiable and repeatable or repeated spatial types, certain basic spatial types, in particular the plaza, the square, the boulevard, the avenue, and the street. I'll mention alleys too, but particularly the five: plaza, square, boulevard, avenue, street. And then I want to talk about two building types that are sort of the most basic way of thinking about buildings found in cities. Buildings that we call foreground buildings and buildings we call background buildings. Next slide. Okay, so again, I'm indebted to Leon Creer for this wonderful, and actually a number of diagrams that he has produced over the years that articulate this, in a very concise and easily understandable way, this understanding of the formal order of traditional cities. There is what Creer calls the public realm, the res publica. And if you look at this little diagram, what he calls monuments without streets and squares, you can see that every one of the buildings here is different from every other building, right? Each one has its own shape, has its own unique shape. There's nothing that they have certain things they have in common with each other, but they're not repeatable. They're unique. Next slide. Actually, go back one. And the important thing to understand about these buildings too, since I'll come back to the issue of foreground building and background building, is that these are the kinds of buildings that in a traditional city are properly understood as foreground buildings. That is, by foreground buildings, again, if you go back to this idea of you're perceiving something against a background, these are the buildings that are meant to be seen. Monumental buildings, foreground buildings are buildings that are meant to be seen. Next slide. Then there's what Creer calls the res economica, or the private realm, which consists mainly of residential buildings and commercial buildings, and which function primarily as background buildings. Background in the sense that this kind of building makes space, right? You can see how all these blocks are more or less uniform. They're really not very distinguishable at all from each other in any essential way. But when you put them together, they form this network of linear streets and centralized plazas and squares, and that is and it's in their role as background buildings that they're doing that. In other words, they are making figural space to which they are the defining background. Next slide. And then what Creer shows is that when you take the public realm of civic foreground buildings that are unique. And of course, in real-life cities, these are the most important kinds of civic buildings, right? They're the churches, the town halls, the libraries, various kinds of civic buildings. When you take these and you put them together with the background buildings, that together what you get is the city, right? So you can see in this little diagram of the city the relationship that Creer describes between public space, centralized spaces, linear spaces, streets, squares, foreground buildings, background buildings. It's all right there in this diagram. Next. Another aspect, a critical aspect of traditional neighborhood design has to do with this dimension that I mentioned earlier, the half-mile radius, or the half-mile diameter circle, or the square, the quarter-mile radius, the 5-minute walk, which I'm characterizing here as the measure of good urbanism. These are drawings, little plan drawings of several historic European cities: Dresden, Florence, Amsterdam, Venice, Berlin. And around them is an orange circle. The orange circle represents a 1/2 mile diameter. Right? So that any of you, if you know Florence, right, here's the Duomo in Florence, the Baptistery, here's the Piazza dei Signori here, here's the Uffizi Gallery. And in Florence, that's a 1/2 mile in that direction. It gives you an idea of the sort of density and quantity and proximity of culture that you can get within a 1/2 mile area. And in fact, I'm certain that later in the week, one of the things that we'll show you is we'll show you this diagram of Florence, and we'll show you a similar diagram of Florence, Massachusetts, with a 1/2 mile diameter around it, and we can compare and contrast, both for your benefit and for ours, the different kind of densities that exist in these two Florences. Next slide. But it gives you an idea of the sort of the quality of culture that you can get within 120 acres, if you think about it. So I mentioned earlier that the neighborhood, thinking about big cities and doing urban design, right? Because urban design is done for small towns, urban design is done for big city neighborhoods. It's done at a number of different scales. But the fundamental unit of urban design is the neighborhood. And what we mean by the neighborhood, again, is this sort of mix of uses within pedestrian proximity of each other that is anywhere from 120 to 200 acres. So this is Mr. Bess's neighborhood in Chicago, right here, where I lived for 25 years and brought up 3 children. My wife and I brought up 3 children. This is a half mile by half mile, and this is that half mile by half mile right here. 160 acres. Next slide. So what I want to suggest is that a neighborhood standing alone, right, is a village, right? And there's a very distinct edge between the edge of the town and the beginning of, in this case, the agricultural landscape. You can see that edge right here, right? So a neighborhood standing alone is a village. Next. A couple of neighborhoods or 3 neighborhoods together constitute a small town, right? This is Cooperstown, New York, right here. Here's the main street in Cooperstown, the ballpark. There's several neighborhoods around the edge of the center of Cooperstown. And so you get several neighborhoods together and you have a small town. Next. And then you get a lot of, in a big city, you get a lot of neighborhoods together. This is Mr. Bess's neighborhood in its actual context in Chicago, right here. It's about 5 miles in this direction and about 6 miles in this direction, which is just slightly smaller than Northampton's area. You can see, this is about the size of Northampton, and this is the kind of density you get in a neighborhood in Chicago, and you can see that it's made up of, Chicago is made up of a number of these different kinds of neighborhoods. Next slide. This is what I was chuckling about because I realized, I forgot that I didn't get the image of Northampton to scale to show in this context. Next. Then another idea having to do with the mix of uses that is typically found in a neighborhood within, the mix of uses within pedestrian proximity. And here again, Leon Creer has this very suggestive drawing when he talks about the characteristics of traditional cities, that a traditional city is like a pizza, right? And a slice of the pizza is like a neighborhood, right? And why is that? Why is a neighborhood like a slice of pizza? A neighborhood is like a slice of pizza because a neighborhood has within it all of the same ingredients that the rest of the city has, right? In the same way that a slice of pizza has on it all the rest of the ingredients that the rest of the pizza has. Whereas in contrast, our post-1945 patterns of development separate uses from each other. In much, it would be as if you took the crust and you put it over here, and the sauce over here, and the cheese over here, and the pepperoni over there, right? And you had to drive your car to get to each one of these ingredients. And of course the problem is that even though you have the same ingredients of the pizza, right, when they are separated from each other, they're not a pizza, right? Because what a pizza is all of these ingredients together. So in just the same way, a traditional city is all of these ingredients together, and a slice of pizza, or a neighborhood in the city is like a slice of the pizza. Next slide. So, speaking of post-1945 development, patterns of development, and there's a lot of historical reasons why what we call sprawl, the patterns of development that began after 1945. There's a lot of reasons, historical reasons why it happened. There's a lot of reasons why, in fact, it wasn't, and to some extent remains, still a cultural ideal. And so I don't want to suggest that sprawl, that Americans were dragged kicking and screaming into making sprawl environments. But more and more people are rethinking that, particularly in light of certain economic and environmental realities that are upon us. But nevertheless, I think it's possible, just apart from whether people liked it or don't like it or don't like it, want it or don't want it, it's possible to describe sprawl as this separation of uses into what New Urbanists call monocultures, right? That what you get in sprawl is one kind of thing that's developed, and adjacent to it another single kind of thing that's developed, and adjacent to that another single kind of thing that's developed, and that constitutes that and the physical infrastructure of roads that exist, that connect all of these things, that can only be reached by automobile, typically. That is a defining characteristic of our post-1945 patterns of human settlement. So what are the components of sprawl? Well, this is a monoculture of housing. Right? Pretty much all the same kind of house. Next. This is a monoculture of shopping. Next. This is a monoculture of offices. Next. Civic buildings in sprawl contexts become very similar to any other kind of big box, right? And so what is this particular big box? It could be a medium security prison. It happens to be a high school. But the idea is that it is a kind of big box suburban solution that is quite different from the kinds of, and really the treatment, the architectural treatment of schools as civic buildings in typically a neighborhood or typically in an urban context. Next. Another component of sprawl, of course, as I mentioned, is this infrastructure that connects all of these different separated activities. The auto-oriented pedestrian hostile infrastructure, you can see this is a not atypical suburban arterial in Northern California. You can see everything is oriented to the automobile. There are no sidewalks anywhere here. There's one pedestrian in this photo who's about to die. I fear that anyway. I hope that didn't happen. But you can see it's a lonely existence as a pedestrian in this kind of environment. Next slide. And then this is what you get when you get three sprawl monofunctional zones placed adjacent to each other and sort of how it works, right? Because here you have the single-family houses. Right? You've got the single-family house developments, development right here. You've got apartment complex, suburban apartment developments over here. You've got the big box shopping, the retail complex, exclusively retail complex over here, with a parking lot designed to handle the Friday after Thanksgiving shopping, right? But looks like this, most of the year. And if you happen to live here, right, you are really you're less than 100 yards. I mean, you're less than a sandwich, right, from the store here. But there's no way that you could walk 100 yards, to go get a gallon of milk or a loaf of bread or something like that. What you have to do is you get in your car and you drive, out the cul-de-sac to the connector road up to here. You drive out here to the feeder roads to the arterial, and you take this arterial over here and you intersect with this arterial over here, and then you drive in, you park your car, you get out and you walk in. If it's busy enough, maybe you have to park over here, which isn't that much further than it is there. You park the car and you walk in and you buy your thing, and you back in your car and you go back and do it again. And for all of the kinds of criticisms about New Urbanist developments, which are in many ways reasonably criticized for sort of not becoming instant traditional neighborhoods, at the very least, by having a mix of uses proximate to each other, even if people, someone who lives in a New Urbanist, some greenfield development has to drive to work, right? At least when they come home, they don't necessarily have to drive to pick up, the loaf of bread or the gallon of milk. They don't have to drive their kids to play. The kids can, so you don't need to use the car as often if you start designing environments that mix uses instead of separating them. But when they're separated, you literally have to drive to everything. Next slide. Okay, so what are the spatial characteristics of traditional cities? They are this network of streets and squares. Next. So I want to just talk very briefly about these urban spatial types and just show examples of them. And they're on the list. They're on your list. I want to talk about plazas. I want to talk about squares. I want to talk about boulevards, avenues, and streets. Okay? So these are all examples of a very common urban spatial type, more European than American, right? But common nonetheless. That we refer to as a plaza, or the Italian word is piazza. The essential feature of which is that it's a centralized space, it's a centralized public space that is hard surfaced. And so you can see here's the Campo in Siena, here's the Berg Square, it's a plaza, but they call it the Berg Square in Bruges. Here's the main piazza in the Italian hill town of Todi. Here's the main piazza in Pienza in Italy. They all have this characteristic feature of a hard surface public space fronted by public buildings. These are major centralized gathering spaces in very precise sense of the word, spaces, right? They're figural, they have form, they're used for public purposes, they're where the most important things take place. This is where they have the New Year's celebration every year in Todi and fire off the fireworks, and that's where that kind of stuff takes place. Next. In contrast to the plaza, which is hard surface, typically European, in some ways in its origins, at least its European origins, Southern European, although there are analogs, all around the Mediterranean and analogs in other cultures as well. But in contrast to that European hard surface plaza, there's an Anglo-American tradition of squares. Squares being, like a plaza, a centralized figural space, but instead of being a hard surface space, a planted surface, right? And so here you have a square in Paris that is opposite which, but not in the picture, is the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève. Here is Berkeley Square in London. This is Louisbourg Square in Boston. As you can see, this is more of an Anglo-American phenomenon than it is a European phenomenon. But Louisbourg Square in Boston, and of course Jackson Square in New Orleans. But an example of what I mean about both plazas and squares are important public spaces, right? Particularly like in New Orleans, it's Jackson Square that is fronted by the cathedral in New Orleans. In France, the square here is fronted by the library. So that's a very common kind of thing that, whether in a European plaza or an Anglo-American square, it's fronted by a public building. The public building gives greater prominence to the centralized space. The centralized space gives greater prominence to the building that fronts it. There's a reciprocal relationship between the building and the space. And usually, again, this is a foreground building that fronts the space. We'll talk about that in a minute. But urbanism is all about this reciprocity between figure and ground, between space understood as a figure, between certain buildings understood as a figure. And there's a whole vocabulary of urban design that was employed and understood in the design professions until we really sort of lost that after 1945. Next. The boulevard is boulevards, avenues, streets are all examples of linear spaces, right? The others, the plaza and the square are examples of centralized spaces. And most cities are made up primarily, most of the spaces that you find in traditional urbanism are streets and avenues and boulevards. Fewer avenues, fewer boulevards than streets, but more of those altogether than obviously than squares or plazas. But if you think about it, a boulevard is analogous to a square in that it is a hierarchically important street that's usually a major thoroughfare that has a median, that has a planted median, like a square is planted, a boulevard is planted. And so this is, possibly the best boulevard in the United States. This is Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, as seen from the air. This is the median shot of Commonwealth Avenue, where monuments occurred, so it's about a mile long, leading up here to the Boston Public Gardens. This is a shot of one of the thoroughfares, one of the roadbeds on one side of the boulevard, and then this is the sidewalk, it's the pedestrian area that runs along the edge of that roadbed. And so you can see it works at the scale. It moves a lot of traffic, but it's also a place you walk your dog, you walk your babies, you encounter monuments. It's a civic place. Lots of things happen there. Next slide. It can occur at a smaller, more domestic scale as well. This is a linear, quarter-mile long boulevard on a residential street in Cooperstown with a monument at each end, so that the people who designed the boulevard understood it was a grand thing. So a war memorial at one end, and there's a World War I here, and I think Civil War at the other end. So they really understood this relationship between monumentality and the street type, even at this small residential scale of a quarter mile in Cooperstown, New York. Next. And then there are the second urban spatial type, sort of equal in importance to the boulevard, is the avenue. The avenue, in the context of a big city, it's a grand major street. In the context of a neighborhood, it's typically a major commercial street. In the context of a small town, it's usually Main Street. And so, you can see examples of avenues. I mean, this is arguably the most famous avenue in the world, the Champs-Élysées in Paris. There are 10 lanes of traffic here, right? 8 lanes of traffic and 2 lanes of parking. And 70, the sidewalks are 75 feet wide. You wonder, you can't imagine having enjoying a cup of coffee adjacent to that arterial, that Northern California arterial that I showed. But that's only 5 lanes, right? The Champs-Élysées has 10 lanes of traffic, but people sit out there and they drink coffee and discuss politics and everything. And how can they do that? Well, it's because the sidewalks are 75 feet wide, right? The sidewalks are 75 feet wide, and they're zoned with a layer of trees. So there's a layer for pedestrians, and there's a layer for people sitting at the coffees to have the restaurants adjacent to the shop. So it all works as a pedestrian-friendly environment. So you've got the Champs-Élysées as an avenue. This is Lincoln Avenue in Mr. Bess's neighborhood. This is the main commercial street in the neighborhood that I live in Chicago. This is Main Street in Skaneateles, New York, which is also a state road, right? So the state road comes in from out of town. When you get to the edge of the town, you're going 55 miles an hour, and you slow down to 30, and the road narrows and becomes a main street, and you drive down Main Street at 25 miles an hour because of the design, right? It's because of how things are designed that this happens. And then, and here's one you're all familiar with here in Northampton as an example of Main Street in Northampton is precisely what I mean by an avenue, is a sort of major hierarchy, important street in the city. Next. And then these are examples of streets, right? The street is like the most basic linear urban spatial type, and they come in all kinds of arrangements. But this is a typical street in Bruges. This is a typical street in Charleston. This is a typical street in Nantucket. This is a typical residential street in Chicago. Again, most of the urban spatial condition is made up of streets. Next. And then the alley. I won't say too much about the alley, except that an alley is sort of the lowest level of the hierarchy of linear spaces, but it's essentially a service thing. I know that the layout. Northampton the physical form of Northampton is interesting for a whole lot of reasons, and we'll talk about that over the course of the week. But I know that the alley is not a typical condition in Northampton. I don't know whether it can be or not. I don't know whether it should be. Customs differ. There's certainly some great places in the world that don't have any alleys in them whatsoever. But just briefly, one of the advantages of having alleys is that you can do things like put your garbage in the back, and you can park behind the house instead of parking front-loaded parking from the street, which means you could have uninterrupted curb cuts, which means you can park cars along the edge of the street. You create a safer condition for pedestrians, and it all kind of works in. You put your utilities back there, right? You can locate wires and electrical wires and things like that. So anyway, next slide. Okay, buildings, urban building types, foreground buildings and background buildings. This little diagram again, foreground buildings, meant to be seen. Next. Okay, if we look at these, again, European examples, no trouble here telling in any of these slides what the most important thing is, right? Here, right? Church, Florence, here, Paris Opera House, here, Duomo in Florence, here, statue of Jan van Eyck in this plaza in Bruges. All of these are examples of monumental buildings, or in the case of the statue of Van Eyck, of a monument. But these are foreground urban things. They're meant to be seen, and you can have an object in a space that is meant to be seen. In other words, a space is figural, and a foreground building is figural. But a foreground building can front a figural space, or an object, a monument, can exist within a figural space, and it all works together. Next. These are some American examples of foreground buildings. Top left here, Market Hall, at the end of the street. Here, a church, Mr. Best's neighborhood, fronting a public park. Here, post office in Nantucket. Here, a monument to James Fenimore Cooper in Cooperstown, New York. Again, American analogs to the European examples of foreground buildings and monuments that I looked at earlier. Next. Urban building types, foreground buildings. These are examples of churches, right, that terminate an axial vista, right? So you're walking down the street here, and there's this church that's popped out, the front of which is popped out into the street. In some ways, this is a bit of a historical accident, a happy accident, I would say, because it both, again, the termination of the street with the church, you've got to drive around the front of the church, and you continue on. It makes the church more important. It makes the street more important. The fire marshal would, if you pose that to a fire marshal today, he, would probably not be happy. But no one's ever run into that column in a car. They adjust to it. Human beings adjust. And so, but it's, again, there's the sensibility of the monumentalization of certain kinds of buildings, civic buildings, right? Buildings of importance to the entire community that you find in traditional urbanism. Likewise here in Cooperstown, a little Episcopal church that's on axis from a gated entry. You come into it. It's really quite nice. It's an alley of trees. There's a cemetery on either side. The community of the living and the community of the dead, terminated by the facade of the church. The designer of this complex got it right about this relationship of the foreground building to the public realm. Next. Secular buildings, foreground buildings fronting squares, the old Boston City Hall, Trinity Church, well, not a secular building, but fronting Copley Square, the Town Hall in Antwerp, in Belgium, fronting the public square during a spring flower festival. Next. Urban building types, foreground buildings from the lower left, State House in Boston, public school in Boston, elementary school, a baseball park in Philadelphia, Shibe Park, Boston Public Library, fronting Copley Square. Next. So all examples of foreground buildings. Examples of background buildings. Again, background meaning buildings that define public space. Next. And here, 10 minutes ago, I would have shown you this kind of slide and said, look at the space, right? Look at the plaza, look at the boulevard, look at the avenue, look at the street, look at the boulevard. Okay, I'm showing you the same slide and asking you to concentrate on the background, right? Look at the buildings instead of looking at the space, because this is what we mean by a background building. These are buildings that are not meant to call attention to themselves, right? They're buildings that urbanistically, their intention is to shape the space, right? Because it's the space that's important as the figure. That urban design, and this is something that students and I talk about. It's something we talk about with people with whom we work. Urban design is first and foremost about designing public spaces, and it does entail building design, but it looks at building design with respect to how you design buildings in a way to shape public space. Next. More examples of background buildings. In this case, these are all buildings that have retail below. They're mixed-use buildings and either residences or residences or offices above. Next. Background buildings, single-family houses. Examples of single-family houses as background buildings. Next. Multi-family housing as examples of background buildings. In Chicago, the ubiquitous 2-flat, 3-flat, 3 units here. A 12-flat building, a 12-unit corner apartment building adjacent to a 2-flat here, and the whole block of buildings in the mid-block condition here in Chicago, down the rest of the street are these 2 flats, but at the corner you've got the corner apartment unit that has 12 units on the same block. Next. Okay, 10 characteristics of good towns and neighborhoods. I'm aware of where the time is going, and it's going way fast, so I'm honest. I will stay as long to talk as you want to stay, and I'll try not to keep you too late, so I'll try to speed through this. 10 characteristics of good towns and neighborhoods. There's been some discussion, or I mentioned earlier, this relationship between the similarity between a small town, the physical form of a small town, and the physical form of a big city neighborhood. And I want to show, you have a handout with these 10 characteristics of good towns and neighborhoods. And I want to just sort of illustrate that example with examples primarily from comparing the small town of Skaneateles, New York population, the village population of 2,200, and Mr. Bess's neighborhood in Lincoln Square, population of about 5,000, but in the context of a city of 3 million. Next. Okay. Also, intermittently, I have put slides of a similar example from Northampton. Last minute adjustment. A good town or neighborhood has a discernible center. Okay. In the case of Skaneateles, it's Main Street here. In the case of Chicago, Mr. Bess's neighborhood is Lincoln Avenue. In the case of Northampton, arguably, I'm still learning about Northampton, arguably it's Main Street. Next. A good town or neighborhood may have a more or less discernible edge. The center is critical. The edge may or may not exist. Certainly in the case of Skaneateles, you have the edge of the lake. You've got agricultural landscape that begins out in here, actually beyond the big new modern public schools. But agricultural landscape that starts out here. Mr. Bess's neighborhood, you've got more city, right? And the streets that sort of in this diagram define the edge. Actually, sometimes for some people may function as a center, right? So that this avenue right here, I'm showing it as the edge of this neighborhood, but in fact, for some people who live here and here, it may be more like the center of the neighborhood instead of the edge. But you get more of that kind of ambiguity in an urban neighborhood environment. Next. A good town and neighborhood is pedestrian friendly, right? And generous sidewalks, places to sit, cars parked along the edge of the street provide a certain kind of protection, interesting storefronts, trees, and typically in grates, but it's a pleasant walking environment. Next. A good town or neighborhood has a variety of dwelling types. In this case, in Skaneateles, the bulk of the primary housing type is the single-family house. In Chicago, actually, there's really sort of two of the primary building types. One is the Chicago bungalow, the single-family house. The other is the two-flat. And Chicago is made up largely, housing in Chicago is made up of bungalows and two-flats. Next. Continuing this idea of a variety of dwelling types, right? You've got row houses, a few row houses in Skaneateles. You've got, in this case in Chicago, you've got the 12-flat on the corner. Actually, this is not in Northampton, but it is in South Hadley. This is a 6-flat apartment building that, as we were driving around today in Northampton, we saw a number of buildings that give the appearance of being large Victorian houses, but in fact they're 6-unit apartment buildings. And good towns and neighborhoods have these kinds of buildings mixed in throughout them to provide a variety of housing types. Next. Again, on the variety of dwelling types, carriage houses. This is a carriage house in Skaneateles. This is a carriage house that's not in Chicago. It's in Florida. But this is the ancillary building to this larger building. This is the carriage house that we saw in Northampton today, driving around. There was another one that we saw too. So we saw several of them. But again, it's a common it's a common traditional neighborhood building type. Next. Still with dwelling types, the type of the apartment above the store. And here I didn't have good examples, good photographic examples from either Skaneateles or Chicago, though it exists in both places. But these are two examples from Boston, where you have apartments above retail, below. Similar situation here. Next. A good town or a neighborhood has stores and offices that are located at and or near its center. Right? Certainly the case in Skaneateles, the center on Main Street, Lincoln Avenue, center in Lincoln Square, also in Northampton. Right? Obviously you have stores and offices located at and or near the center of Northampton. Next. A good town or neighborhood has an elementary school and parks and playgrounds to which most children can walk. Right? So this is a public park. I'm sorry. This is in Chicago. This is an elementary school. In this case, it's a Catholic. It's a parochial school in Chicago. This is a public park in Skaneateles along Lakefront. This is a local neighborhood elementary school, obviously here in Northampton. Next. A A good town or neighborhood has small blocks with a network of through streets. In Skaneateles, you can see, a little bit of that. If you had an opportunity to examine it in more detail, you can see it. In Chicago, you have this obvious network of streets and blocks here on a regular kind of grid. Northampton, you notice, doesn't have a grid. One of the many interesting features, charming features of Northampton that we're looking forward to addressing and looking at and understanding further. But even without a grid, even sort of traditional cities, even if they don't have a regularized kind of grid, they are nevertheless made up of typically of networks of streets and blocks, through streets and blocks. You don't find in medieval cities, in medieval European cities, you don't find cul-de-sacs, right? That the streets connect, even if the blocks are irregular, the streets are narrow, and the streets themselves are not straight. They connect. The blocks and the street network connects. Next. A good town or neighborhood places its buildings close to the street, in a disciplined kind of way. This is even in the residential, it's a residential neighborhood. In Skaneateles, you can see the buildings line up to a common build-to line. Same thing in Chicago, residential street. It's also true of commercial streets. Northampton, similar example. Next. A good town or neighborhood utilizes its streets for parking. Skaneateles, Chicago, Northampton. Next. A good town or neighborhood reserves prominent sites for civic buildings and community monuments. This is Skaneateles, Chicago, again, church fronting the public park. Skaneateles, Northampton. America, and it's always a little more difficult in America. The examples of this, of monumental sites, or sites for public buildings, civic buildings, monumental buildings, foreground buildings. The more pure examples are European, but you do find them in America as well. But even driving around any American city that was built before 1945, you can recognize a hierarchy of building types and where they're located, both from where they're located and the kind of architectural embellishment that they have. Next. Okay, getting close to the end. I want to talk briefly about the idea, and again, there's a handout here. We're talking about the idea of the rural to urban transect and transect-based zoning and form-based codes. Because I think particularly reading Sustainable Northampton, I think that the transect, I want to suggest that the transect may be a useful way for, in some ways, summarizing in a more concise way a lot of the concerns that are expressed in Sustainable Northampton. I don't want to say summarizing or addressing, but that the idea of the transect is something that sort of comprehends, and it's something that I think someone who understands the transect would understand exactly what you're trying to do in Northampton, the Sustainable Northampton. And so I'm hoping that transect will make sense as an idea. So some of these themes that in Sustainable Northampton that we've been reading about, a sort of sensitivity to the place of Northampton within its region, right, is a major theme. The idea of the community using renewable and efficient and more efficient energy sources. That there should be in Northampton a variety of housing types, including units, owner-occupied units and rental units, and the issue of affordability is a concern. The idea that capital improvements in Northampton should be made in accordance with the ideals of Sustainable Northampton. And of course, this goes back to this relationship between the city as an economic order and the city as a moral and formal order. That there's all these things are in tension with each other. But certainly the aspiration is that these capital improvements in the future should be made in accordance with the ambitions of Sustainable Northampton. And then some of the things that I think are especially pertinent to the idea of the rural to urban transect is this idea that within Northampton you have both rural and urban land, and that this is something to be respected. I think that for me, and the students and I have talked about this a little bit, for me, two of the most interesting things about Northampton are one, that the street network is it doesn't have the density, but it has the character of a more medieval city, right? That it's pre-grid, it's a pre-rational city in that sense. And this, of course, it has to. this has to do, of course, with topography, but it also has to do with customs of city making that Northampton inherited as part of its Anglo-American founding, and so that's something that we're very interested in studying further and trying to understand further. But then the other thing is that you have within the city limits agricultural land, which is not something that is part of any of the charrette experiences that I've had that I can recall. That usually the agricultural land is outside the city, and so the fact that it's within the city limits is a really interesting condition and presents a number of interesting possibilities with respect to growth in Northampton and its relationship to agriculture. And again, when I show you the diagram of the transect, I hope that you'll recognize that this is a diagram that embodies some of these kinds of concerns and understandings of the nature of cities generally, but of Northampton in particular. So there's an interest, we read in Sustainable Northampton this interest in rural and urban land, of a variety of densities and uses within the city itself, of good public transit, of energy efficiency, of conserving a variety of both agricultural lands and natural landscape. And as I say, all of these things I think are to some extent addressed or implicit in the idea of the rural to urban transect. Then the other things, just at the beginning, and we've studied this. Obviously, the document goes into it in more detail, but in terms of the work that we do in the coming week, and actually throughout the semester, the ambitions of the plan to concentrate new traditional development in existing historic city centers is obviously a really, or at least it seems to us, a really critical issue, both from the perspective that we bring, but also from the work that you've already done in thinking about this. The ambition to promote low-density development and sympathetic development in local watershed areas and in floodplains, along with a sort of corresponding transfer of development rights. It's another set of interesting issues for us to be thinking about. The expansion of land for commercial development. And this is one where I have a question that again is related to the idea of the transect that I'll talk about in a minute, because it seems to me and us from a first reading of this ambition that you want to expand land in Northampton for commercial development, that it represents a way of thinking about commercial development that is characteristically post-1945 in that it's thinking about land development in terms of use. And one of the differences in approaching land use decisions when looking at it from the perspective of the transect or form-based code is that you don't look at building environments in terms of use. You look at building environments in terms of density and building type. And I'll show you what I mean in running through the idea of the transect. Because the presumption, the reason that a transect-based code does not concern itself with use is because the assumption is that there should be a mix of uses within any zone, within a zone of any density, and that these uses should be within pedestrian proximity, and the fact that uses change over time. Historically, uses change over time. I'll talk about that more in a second. And then finally, this ambition to preserve the farmland and the natural landscape is something that we're very, very sympathetic to. So next slide. So here's the transect. Here's a diagram, two diagrams of the transect, actually. And again, you have this definition of the transect, that's a part of the handout. So the rural to urban transect, and you can see if you look at this diagram, you've got these indication of zones, and we're not going to, and the zone goes from T1, T2, T3, T4, T5, T6, and special districts. We're not going to talk about special districts now, but we'll probably talk about special districts sometime over the course of the week. But basically, you've got these 6 transect zones, T1 through T6, the first 2 of which are the so-called rural transect zones, and the last 4 of which are the urban transect zones. And what it indicates, what the transect indicates is, of course, a range of environments as applied to human settlement patterns. So I'll go through the definition here. The rural to urban transect is a diagram of human habitat that describes the relationship of the rural environment to traditional urban environments. The rural transect proper, zones T1 and T2, which is natural, is T1, and T2 is rural. And the essential difference is that, is that T2 rural is agricultural land. It's settled by human beings. It's cared for by human beings. Human beings occupy it at about the scale of the family, right? But when you get bigger than the scale of the family, you're starting to get into the urban transect zones. But the difference between the rural transect zone and the natural transect zone is that the natural transect zone is nature, right? It's not, I should say, it's nature uninhabited by human beings. Human beings may tend some little piece of it. In other words, the forest ranger may have a hut, or you may have a fire tower, out in the national park. But that's an example of a natural environment that is essentially unoccupied by human beings. Whereas the rural environment is settled and cared for by human beings, agriculturally. So the rural transect proper designates areas generally not subject to human settlements larger than the family, and differentiates between natural landscapes, both raw and preserved, and cultivated landscapes. The urban transect refers in turn to that range of human habitats that support human flourishing, within which human settlements are part of a sustainable ecosystem that includes both natural and cultivated landscapes. This range of human habitats, depicted as transect zones, progresses from less dense human settlements, T3, to more dense human settlements, most dense human settlements, T6. But, and this is critical, each urban transect zone denotes a walkable and mixed-use human environment, wherein within each urban T-zone, many, if not most, of the necessities and activities of daily life are within a 5 to 10 minute walk for persons of all ages and economic classes. Now, a word is in order here regarding this definition with respect to the idea of living in a walkable human settlement, because I hear all the time, the accusation that people who promote traditional urbanism are trying to take away people's automobiles. It's not the case. Walkable doesn't mean you don't drive. Walkable means walkable, right? So that the presumption is that if you live in a traditional urban neighborhood, there's nothing wrong if you have to drive outside of your neighborhood to go to work, or drive outside of your neighborhood to do something else as a part of your life. But the idea is that within a walkable human neighborhood, you can do many things, if not most things, that you need to do in your daily life, and that those things, you can do those things and that they exist within pedestrian proximity. So again, there's a difference between walkable and the notion of having to live all of your life within a 160-acre area and you can't get outside the compound. That's not it at all. It's that you have a certain freedom, right? A certain sense of freedom both from the automobile and for the automobile, right? But in this kind of environment, the automobile becomes more of a convenience, right, and less of a necessity, something to enjoy rather than something that you depend upon for every aspect of your existence. So that's it. Now, so here's this diagram, right? And you can see in the diagram a plan and a section diagram here of what the T-zone looks like from the natural to the rural to the suburban. T3 is suburban. T4 general urban, which is what most cities are made up of. T5 urban center, which is a more dense condition, but not the most dense condition. And then T6 urban core. And the same diagram is shown here in three-dimensional form, except it doesn't have the T1 natural landscape, but it has T2, the cultivated landscape, T3 suburban, T4 the general urban, T5 urban center, and T6 urban core. Next. Okay, so what does the transect have to do with transect-based zoning? The idea behind transect-based zoning, as I suggested earlier, is that you don't zone, that zoning codes since 1945 are essentially use-based. They're use-based zoning codes. They represent a negative control about what you do or you don't build someplace according to use. And so when I say it's a negative control, it doesn't typically support a positive vision that a community has for how it wants to develop, which is precisely the intention of a transect-based ordinance, a transect-based code, or a form-based code that works in tandem with a visual master plan that a community adopts or develops, or however it works out, whether it works out in the context of a charrette, or whether there's some professional organization that does this. But that's one of the essential differences between a form-based code and a transect-based code, and a post-1945 use-based code. So transect-based zoning is, so the transect as a system of classification deploying the conceptual range rural to urban. The transect can be employed to arrange in useful order the typical elements of urbanism, within which continuum every urban element finds its place. The continuum of the transect, when subdivided, forms the primary basis of the following zoning categories listed from most rural, least dense, to most urban, most dense. And I've already gone through those. But these categories zone primarily for density and building type rather than for use, because it's a premise of transect-based zoning that a mix of uses is desirable and the uses change over time. All urban transect zones therefore allow broadly for adjacent residential, commercial, and light industrial uses, though some of these uses are designated as primary and some secondary to particular building types. And I'll show you what I mean as we go on next. Okay, so this is an example. I just want to show photos and examples of each of these T-zones and what they look like. And of course, each of these T-zones, they take on a different appearance in different places as a product of different cultural sensibilities and different traditions of building. But they generally follow the kind of density and building type patterns that I'm talking about here. So this is natural, right? This is the natural zone, the T1 zone. And this is actually the town of Empire, Michigan, but it's this area here that's natural. This is Sleeping Bear Dunes National Park on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. And all of this, as national park, constitutes an example of what I'm talking about by T1 natural. Next. This is somewhere in flyover country, Illinois, Kansas, obviously taken while I was flying over. But an example, again, this is a human settlement, a town, right, in the context of an agricultural settlement, or of land that is being put to agricultural use, and is an example of what I mean by T2, farms, forest preserves, things that are tended for by human beings, or tended to by human beings. Next. Okay, now, we're getting into the urban transect zones. Suburban, T3. The density of the suburban T3 zone is not dissimilar to the density of a typical post-war residential subdivision. Right? The difference between the T3 zone and a residential subdivision is not the density, the number of dwelling units per acre. The difference is that in a T3 zone, this density is achieved in a context that is also walkable and within pedestrian proximity of other uses, right? So that if you live in a post-war subdivision, likely the environment is not walkable, and likely you are not within a 5-minute walk to anything other than the kind of house that you live in. Whereas in a T3 urban context, as here, this is in Skaneateles, New York, you've got large houses, big setbacks, relatively large lots. You can see where the sort of what I would characterize as the T4 zone is beginning down here, but you've got this in the context of a main street, a sidewalk, planter strips, lawns, a walkable environment, and you are in fact within a 5-minute walk to a number of other kinds of uses, public park, convenience store, things like that. So this is what we mean by, it's the difference between a T3 suburban zone and a post-war residential subdivision. Next. And these are all examples of T3. Cooperstown, Skaneateles, New Orleans, right? New Orleans has its T3 neighborhoods. Next. General urban, T4. This is the residential building type that generally in any place, T4 is what you have it's the most of the residential building type that you find. Right? Wherever you find the most of a certain residential building type, then you're probably in a T4 area. And this can be obviously this can be defined in a variety of ways. But if you see what I mean from these illustrations. Next. The other thing about the T3 zone and the T4 zone is that typically they're made up of residential building types, and it's an important distinction to make between a building type and a building style. And again, we'll talk about this throughout the course of the week. But one of the key things about this notion of a building type of a T T-zone being defined by building type and density is that it presumes, even though the building type is in the T3 and T4 zone is a residential building type, other uses are allowed. And in any town before 1945, you'll find examples of exactly what I mean. In fact, there were examples in your own literature. We were looking at the historic preservation guidelines, and I forget what the category was exactly, but it was defining just this phenomenon, which is you have a building that was built as a house, some big Victorian house, right? Obviously, it was built as a house. Anybody that looked at it would say it's a house, but in fact, it's not used as a house. It's used as a funeral parlor, or it's used as a lawyer's office, or it's used as a bed and breakfast, or it's, there's some other use that is going on in that house, in addition to just being a dwelling unit. And that's what we mean by, in form-based codes, this kind of zoning, there's typically a fair amount of latitude with respect to the kinds of uses that can take place within a building type, that what you're concerned about is not the use. What you're concerned about is the building type. And if there are particularly noxious uses, right, that a community does not want to have in its community, then the way that you do that is that when you write the code, you identify the specific uses that are prohibited. But the assumption is that if it's not prohibited, it's okay, right? Which is, again, the exact opposite of a zoning system that presumes to define things according to use. And I mean, it's not quite all that black and white. I mean, there's shades of gray in there, but that's the basic idea, the basic premise. And so, anyway, in T4 and urban general, and T3, the building types are residential, whereas in T5 and T6, they're mixed use, and we'll get to that in a second. These are all examples of T4. This is T4 as it looks like, an example of T4 street in Bruges, a T4 street in Nantucket, a T4 street in Chicago, a T4 street in Cooperstown. Next. T5, urban center. The building type changes. It's not typically single use or residential. It's typically mixed use designed for retail at grade and other uses on the second floor. Next. Right, so you get examples of T4 in Italy, San Gimignano, or in Mr. Bess's neighborhood in Lincoln Square. The building types are T5 building types. New Orleans, right? Retail activities at grade, residences above. Little river town in Ripley, Ohio, along the Ohio River. A little block of T5 development right here. Next. And then finally, T6 is the most dense, the most urban. It's Manhattan. Maybe it's not Manhattan, but it's certainly Paris, and it's certainly Rome. There's a question New Urbanists talk about whether certain really high densities are permissible, whether there's an upper limit of what should be considered permissible density in T6. That's not a debate that we need to concern ourselves with here. But this is an example, right? In Paris would be an example of what we mean by urban core, T6. Next. So you get the Campo dei Fiori in Rome, the Champs-Élysées in Paris, this is all T6. Regent Street in London, Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, maybe it's arguable whether that's T6. We won't argue about it now. Next. Now, the other thing is, importantly, the transect diagram is just a diagram, right? It shows a gradation of, from most rural to most urban. But that's not, in reality, how things work, right? I mean, real cities don't look exactly like the transect. There's a lot about urbanism that the transect leaves out. The transect doesn't show civic buildings, right? The transect doesn't show specific kinds of public spaces. It doesn't show squares. It doesn't show plazas. For that, you have to have design, right? And transect-based zoning doesn't work at all unless it's working in tandem with some community consensus about design that it's intended to support. But in reality, you don't just get T2 next to T3, next to T4, next to T5, next to T6. You can get conditions where you've got T5 adjacent to T2, right? So like here, for example, this is St. Andrews, Scotland, where you've got a golf course out here that is T2, right? It's rural, it's tended to by human beings, right up against the edge of an urban center, right there along the edge of the golf course. You've got a T5 adjacent to T2. Next slide. Most dramatically, perhaps, in Manhattan, you've got a zone that is T6, right here, adjacent to what is arguably T2, right? So you've got this condition of a dense urban environment adjacent to a large open space. Next. I'm looking at the time. The idea behind transect-based zoning is that it works in tandem with a master plan that that the master plan, together with a couple of other documents, 3 other kinds of documents, form the legal basis for thinking about making human settlements according to transect-based codes. And the first document, the first aspect of the legal document, is the master plan drawing that sort of creates a positive vision for what some area, some part of a community would look like. And of course, it's entirely different when you're working in a greenfield site than when you're working in the context of an existing city, right? That in the context of an existing city, you're looking for areas in which you might do some kind of infill work, or you're looking for areas where there might be some potential for some smaller scale new development. You don't just come in and wipe the slate clean, like Le Corbusier tried to do with Paris, but you look at an existing context and you work with the good things that are there. But nevertheless, what you're doing when you're doing urban design is you're proposing a kind of positive vision. And the master plan drawings are all of the drawings that show what that would be. The perspective drawings, the plan drawings, everything that is a visual representation of the design intentions. It's supported by a regulating plan, a single document that looks like a regular zoning, document, except that the zones that it describes, again, are not defined according to use, but they're defined according to density and building type. Next. Supporting then the regulating plan is a visual zoning code, right, in which you identify the kinds of lots that are found in each of the T zones and the kinds of buildings that are allowed, the types of buildings. And again, this is apart from architectural style. The types of buildings that are permitted within a certain T zone on certain lots, with respect to where they're located in the lot relative to the street, how much off-street parking there is, what the height of the building is, and what the permitted or forbidden uses are. And all of this, again, is detailed stuff that we'll get into next. Okay, I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna stop. I've got one more section to go, but I've talked long enough. So, yeah, just run through the slide. Traditional urbanism is green. I guess I'm not stopping. Is green insofar as it's nourishing, right? It's the city of San Gimignano and its adjacent agricultural landscape. Insofar as it's accessible, you have a variety of transportational modes within the car, or within the city: cars, bicycles, pedestrian activities. It's serviceable, that is to say, there's a variety of things that are immediately accessible in a variety of housing types that can accommodate firefighters and policemen and nurses, teachers, tradesmen and women, university professors, museum employees, all those. You have a variety of housing types accommodating a variety of people, and secure. This is very secure. Next. And then traditional building is green, and again, this is a longer discussion, is green insofar as it is lovable, or maybe not. Insofar as it's durable, insofar as it's flexible, that its uses can change over time, and insofar as it's frugal. Pretty basic stuff right here that's 400 years old in Bruges. This is affordable housing, as the Belgians did it in the 16th century, still working. Next. Oh, I have to say something about this. This is another Leon Career diagram. He taught at Yale University. Yale University has just renovated their architecture building, which is 35 years old, 38 years old, 40 years old. They've just renovated it for $160 million, which is the cost of 4 new buildings that we recently built at Notre Dame. And not cheap buildings at Notre Dame, pretty good buildings at Notre Dame. But Leon Career taught at Yale University, and he did this little diagram after he taught there. He talks about Yale University buildings and how they age, and their first major maintenance campaigns. That the buildings that were built in 1900 were so well built that the first major restoration took place in 1990. The buildings that were built in 1925 were built so well that the first major restoration occurred in 1990. buildings that were built in 1950 were built so well that the first major renovations took place in 1990. The buildings that were built in 1975 were built so poorly that the first major renovation occurs in 1990. So, next. Next. A little diagram of townscape. What he calls the animated facade and the poor paving, as opposed to the poor facade and the animated paving. And it's talk about, house, houses, housing. Next. Yeah, next. 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 And we're done. And I always go longer than I need to, and so I'm sorry. I'll stay as long as you want. And maybe there are questions. Yes?
Where in all this do you have industry, manufacturing,
Yeah, that's an interesting. No, that's a great question. The question is, where within traditional urbanism do you have industry and manufacturing? It's an interesting question for a couple of reasons. Well, the short answer is that some kinds of industry you can actually have embedded, within the neighborhood. So, that, for example, I had my office for 11 years in Chicago in a former warehouse building that was on one side of the major metro rail line, suburban rail line, on the other side of which were more industrial buildings. And then on the other side, on the alley side, the L ran through. My children loved it because I worked between two train tracks. And then on the other side of which were the backs of garages of houses, right? So that the factories, or I should say the factories were in this corridor that were, again, part of this network, this walkable network of streets and blocks. But the kind of industry that was there was, it wasn't a hog rending plant or something like that. It wasn't a noxious use. But there's a certain kind of industry that can be supported within the context of a traditional city. Now, the other thing is that historically, the traditional city began to fall apart precisely because of the growth of the industrial economy, right? And that was the reason why industry was separated from residential or from urban uses, and why eventually the uses themselves began to be separated from each other as a kind of habit. There's no real reason why, just because you separate industry, you have to separate everything else, but that in fact is what happened. To the extent that we continue to be an industrial economy, we want to have industrial jobs here and not export them someplace else, and to the extent that we can sort of figure out an environmentally sustainable way to do that. To the extent that those kinds of activities that can't go within a traditional neighborhood, that's what the issue, or that's what the category of special district refers to, and is what it's for. And so there's, it's an interesting question. The idea of the business park, right? The idea of a business park is it's a kind of suburban presupposition. It has a suburban presupposition that you separate these uses. I'm not sure why it is that a business can't just be integrated into a neighborhood. And I think, and that would be something that we would want to look at in talking with the business community about, how businesses get integrated into walkable mixed-use neighborhoods. But there are some activities that you don't want, in a walkable mixed-use neighborhood that you want to separate out. And that's what the category of special district is, a kind of concession to that concern. Yes?
I had a couple of related questions about some of the medieval and Renaissance European cities that you showed. One is, were these planned or did they evolve naturally? And the other is, currently, can ordinary working and middle class people afford to live in those beautiful cores of places like London and Paris?
Yeah.
Or are they living in ugly suburban, semi-urban ring developments? And if so, why is that the case?
Yeah, both good questions. Did you hear the questions, or want to repeat them? Okay, all right. The question is, the two questions. One is, I'm having a senior moment. One question, it had to do with the character of medieval and Renaissance urban conditions and whether they were designed. And then the other question had to do with in European cities, in historic centers of European cities, where does the middle class live? Can the middle class afford to live in these historic centers? In answer to the first question, certainly aspects of them were designed. I mean, there's a sense in which any human artifact, and cities are cooperative human artifacts, the people who work on them have an intention in making them that I think is properly characterized as design. There are different design sensibilities that are at work, between medieval cities and Renaissance cities. Certainly, there are certainly pieces of medieval cities where a great deal of care is taken in the design. But again, maybe it's not as sort of rationally consistent as the kind of design work that you start to see in the Renaissance. And it's not even to say that the Renaissance is better for that. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But certainly in the Renaissance, you get pieces of cities that are very carefully designed, down to the details. And it's I mean, again, our students go to Rome. They spend at least a semester in Rome. Some of them longer. A great many of the very best places in Rome are very carefully and meticulously and thoughtfully and beautifully designed. And so, design matters. I would say, with respect to the living conditions for the middle class, cities. The value of cities in a certain sense, they wax and wane. If buildings that are well built, and this is another issue that we might want to talk about over the course of the week. Buildings that are well built hold their value over time. I mean, they may decline for a while. I mean, I know we were talking to, I guess it was today or yesterday. It was this morning. It's been a long day. It was this morning we were talking about the property values in Northampton on Main Street in the mid-1970s, right? You could say the same thing for the property values on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston in the mid-70s. It was very low, and today it's some of the most valuable real estate, in Boston, anywhere, and in Northampton, probably in the state of Massachusetts. And so these things go in cycles. The reason they can go in cycles in some way has to do with the quality of the buildings that endure over time. I think it's harder to make the case that places that are built poorly will maintain any kind of value. At the moment, it seems, I'm guessing that the center part of Northampton is probably not affordable to most middle class. Boston is certainly not. Chicago is not. South Bend is very affordable. South Bend has a lot of affordable housing. What that means is South Bend has a lot of bad housing, right? And it's not affordable because it's not viewed as a particularly desirable place to live. And so any city that is well built and that is a good environment in which to live, it seems to me there's a kind of collective decision making that has to take place, or some kind of agreement that the community has to reach with respect to how how it's going to attend to the concerns of its poorer members. I think that's a perennial human concern, and I think it's part of the notion of the city as a moral order. My sense is that the answers to that can vary, but that it should be a live communal concern. Because it's not the case that when a place is really hot, that middle class people can afford to live there, and that you want to have. I mean, again, one of the ways that you try to address that, at least traditional urbanists try to address it, is by providing different kinds of housing options. It seems to me that the only way that you can sort of make affordable housing that is well built is to make small units. But even in a good environment, even a small unit is very expensive for market reasons. So it's not. We don't have an easy answer to it, but it's a challenge. It's a community challenge. I hope that we can talk about it over the course of the week. You had a question, sir?
Yes, I just wanted to say that I've been fascinated and interested in what you had to say over the past hour. But I would like to focus before everyone leaves this room on what you're planning to do in this coming week. I've noticed that Cooperstown is focused on 2 or 3 or 4 areas within the city. So my question to you is this. Have you at this point in your mind focused in any areas of the city where you think you might be doing the same kind of focus you did in Cooperstown? And if not, how do you plan to go about doing that?
You all hear the question. The question has to do with if we come to any kind of decision about where we're going to focus our attention over the coming week in Northampton. We haven't made any decisions about that. It seems for some, I would say, sort of speaking off the top of my head. Well, first, I got to preface these remarks by saying that all of this is subject to discussion, right? I mean, it's going to we're having a day and a half of conversations beginning tonight. And that will continue beyond the sort of formal meetings with various representatives of the community to sort of hear what are on people's minds with respect to the development agenda in Northampton. We're going to be listening mostly for the next day and a half. But then when the design work starts, the students are going to be looking at the physical characteristics of Northampton and making some proposals. And then tossing those out for public discussion. One of the things that's going to happen, over the course of the week is we're going to sort of figure out what it makes sense for the scope of our work, of our proposed work to be. We have not decided that yet. I will say that with respect to Cooperstown, we started out very sort of small with respect to during the charrette, the areas that we focused on, and because of the logic of things that were happening in Cooperstown, our concerns expanded over the course of the semester, so that by the end of the semester, we were looking at a much larger area in Cooperstown than we were initially, but that was a consequence of our coming to understand the importance of Cooperstown as a regional economic entity in a way that I think Cooperstonians themselves are somewhat reluctant to acknowledge. That's another story. But all that is to say is that the scope of our work, evolved both during the course of the charrette and beyond. Specifically with respect to Northampton, I mean, there's some obvious things that we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at downtown. We're going to be looking at King Street. We're going to be looking at at Leeds, at Florence, at Bay State. We're going to be looking at historic patterns of development in Northampton, how it evolved historically, what it's whether there are any sort of significant differences in the way it's evolved since 1945. Which we suspect that there are, because that's the story of development, in the United States. But so we have a sort of a hunch that there's a story there, but we need to look at it. We need to see it. We'll probably. I mean, I certainly don't want to say that we're going to be able to come up with a plan for all of these different areas, because we have we're 6 people and we have a semester, and Northampton is a big town, but we certainly, I think that we regard it as an obligation to at least address some ideas that would be of general applicability to a number of places in the city, even if we don't specifically address those areas as part of the plan. That's about all I can say as a general statement, but we've just started looking today, so we'll keep going. Yeah.
I wanted to ask my question next because it's a similar question. But before that, I lived in Chicago until 5 years ago, and I love Northampton, but it made me very homesick. The question comes from my assumption, I'm just asking you to tell me if I'm assuming correctly or not, that you gave us the characteristics of good towns and cities because you want to look at ways to design solutions for Northampton to move in some way. I don't want to make you say anything that would be politically incorrect or anything, but you're looking for ways to urge Northampton or parts of Northampton closer to the ideal of the good town and city. Is that right?
Well, let's see. You're not necessarily incorrect, but let me suggest another way to look at it,
Okay.
which is that think about all the things that you love about Northampton. Think about the best things about Northampton, and ask yourself why. I mean, Northampton developed in a certain way over the course of 300 years, in ways that were sort of consistent. I mean, then about 60 plus years ago, it started developing in a different kind of way that some people anyway find problematic. And that I think our presupposition is actually that in some ways we find it problematic. And so the question, another way to phrase the question would be, or the issue would be, is there a consensus in, is there a consensus in Northampton, or might there be a consensus built in Northampton about the desirability of building in the future the way that you built the best parts of Northampton in the past? Is that? It's another way to think of it. So yeah, but I mean, we have a lot to learn about what Northampton residents think is great about Northampton. And
Yeah, and I don't mean to imply that,
Yeah.
that I'm hearing that you have a particular agenda or anything like that. And I know you're not here to say you're doing this all wrong and we've got solutions. I just wanted to, like the last question, get a better understanding of the overarching goal.
Well, I think our assumption is, and it's a bias, and we can test this, talk about it. I think our bias is that, in fact, traditional urbanism, understood as having a historic relationship to the landscape, right? Because I mean, traditional cities have had this historic relationship to an agricultural landscape. They have been characterized by a mix of uses with a pedestrian proximity. They have been characterized by spatial and formal building hierarchies that have made cities understandable. They both express the values of the city and are legible to understandable to the residents of the city itself. That when you're in the city, you sort of understand where you are and who you are and what the values are that you hold as a community. That we think that the formal order of traditional urbanism solves a lot of things that people experience as problems today, having to do with the environment, having to do with sort of the fractured nature of daily living, of having to use a car for everything, and that traditional urbanism. That one of the reasons we think it's good is because it can address those kinds of problems. It can't solve all human problems, but it can address certain things that human beings find problematic about living in the built environment as we build it today. So, yes.
Yeah, I was thinking that urban planning and then its three-dimensional counterpart becomes urban design really assumes that the public is the client. Certainly that's true in a lot of European examples, whether it's royalty, government, or whatever it might be. I'm hoping that you're going to be able to address some of the ways of using urban design to reflect private sector initiatives that really becomes more architecture. Architecture deals with the private sector client very often. And so it becomes a question of are you recognizing land ownership patterns, economic trends? Are you looking at what parcels are actually assemblable, and if so, who could do that? In other words, taking some of the broader planning and urban design concepts and tapping them into the square holes of reality.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. How pragmatic are we going to be? And the answer to that, again, is it's a little bit of an ambiguous answer because, on the one hand, I think, at least I encourage students, will pursue what they pursue, but I encourage students to be mindful of the reality of property rights as a good thing, generally. And so we try to respect, we try to respect sort of existing kinds of conditions, and believe me, we understand that there are there are controversies about land use in Northampton, and so everywhere. And so we let me try to answer this. That we it's a good question. That we're not trying to enter into sort of contemporary hot political discussions in that respect. We also, though, feel like it is part of what we are obliged to do to take a kind of long-term view with respect to sort of highest and best use land use policy, and also in some ways to give a picture back to the community of what at least we understand to be some of your highest ambitions. And so that may mean that we make a proposal for the use of somebody's land that who may not want to sell their land, and they're under no obligation to sell their land, but maybe the vision of that thing persists for quite some time, into the future. And maybe it has a longer. I mean, the plan of Washington D.C., right? It's 200 years old, and it didn't become what it is today until 1900. So.
I'm sorry. Speaking of property rights, this facility is owned by the city owns it, the senior center. We're supposed to be out here 20 minutes ago, and I didn't realize that till I was just told. So I want to thank Phil's been up since 4:30 this morning, by the way. So. And I think we've begun a really good discussion, but we have the rest of the week to continue it. This is the rubber meets the road the rest of the week. So the road is over at 126 Main Street. Hope you'll all come. Those of us who have these little stickers on are the people you can ask questions of. Thank you all for coming.